You're taking a live look at the Joint Transportation Committee meeting in the state capitol tonight. There are 4 bills related to rail in Salem this session that got our attention, and the committee is holding a public hearing on 2 of them tonight. Here they are. Take a look. 2 in the House, 2 in the Senate. The first directs the Oregon Department of Transportation to develop a passenger rail plan to improve Oregon's rail network. The second directs ODOT to work with Washington State and Canada on improvements between Vancouver, BC and Eugene, where the Amtrak Cascades line runs. The other 2 bills are a bit bigger picture. One would create a task force to study a new Cascadia high-speed line linking Portland, Seattle and Vancouver, BC with 200-mile-per-hour trains. And the other would create a new agency called the Oregon Rail Department that would take over all of ODOT's administrative duties for rail. Now, we reached out to a few of the state lawmakers behind these bills. They said as long as they're considering funding for roads and bridges across the state in a massive transportation package, now is the time to talk about passenger rail too. Oregon's busiest passenger rail route is Amtrak Cascades, and it's been quietly on a roll, bouncing back from the pandemic and continuing to grow. Here's what Amtrak told legislators at a November meeting.
The really good news, right? Ridership growth on the Cascades over the last couple of years has been really impressive, and we are well beyond 2019 levels now. You know, Suzanne mentioned it during her presentation, right? Like we are breaking records for overall ridership.
Now, if you ask the lawmakers behind the bills that we mentioned, the rising demand signals that it's time to fix some of the line's chronic problems, namely too few trains and too many delays.
Well, if we had passengers rail service that was more frequent and reliable along the Cascades route, Portlanders could more easily take a train to, for example, catch a Ducks game in Eugene or visit family in Albany, all without having to deal with traffic on the I-5.
If it is more predictable, will enhance ridership because people will know, yeah, I can take that train out of Salem at 6:30 in the morning, and I know that I'll get into Union Station in Portland by, say, 7:30, and I can get to my office at 8 o'clock. I want people to be able to rely on rail as a predictable work-related source of transportation.
Now, unlike other Amtrak routes, Cascades is state-owned, with Oregon and Washington each funding operations along their segments of the line. That means we are the ones who have to pay for service improvements, and money from the gas tax cannot be used for rail because it goes into the state highway fund. Most of Oregon's rail network is privately owned by companies like Union Pacific, so they pay to fix their own tracks. But that means the state-owned Cascades line needs another source of funding from taxpayers and the state. And there are a few, but they're modest at best.
There is something called the lawnmower fund. So there's gas that is not going to be used for vehicles that can go into supporting rail.
There's also another fund called Connect Oregon that hands out competitive transportation grants, but that's not ideal either.
The problem with Connect Oregon is that rail ends up competing with electric vehicle rebates. And so we would like to move rail to its own funding, a better funding source, and then leave the EVs to get better rebates.
ODOT gave legislators an update on improvements to the Cascades line at that November meeting. Oregon's current funding structure brings in about $15.6 million per year for passenger rail operations, enough to run 2 round-trip trains per day between Portland and Eugene. But thanks to inflation and aging infrastructure, it's getting more expensive.
We are seeing costs starting to go up. So we're estimating that by 2026, we're going to need an additional $8.5 million per year to maintain the service we have.
Now, we do have some new trains on the way starting in 2026, funded by former President Biden's 2021 infrastructure law. But expanding the service to make trains more frequent will take a lot more money. Amtrak shares tracks with freight rail, and there are a lot of places where the track has to be upgraded, like adding sidings where freight trains can pull over to let passenger trains go by. Think like a shoulder on a highway. Or adding more crossing gates and overpasses so trains can safely go a little faster.
We're dealing with a rail system which is largely private, but where we want to have the state cooperating with the private sector to maximize what we do in terms of passenger rail as well as freight.
Oregon has been developing a package of upgrades that would allow for 6 train trips per day between Portland and Eugene. But as you might imagine, that would not be cheap.
So averaging that out over 11 years, we got started in 2025 through 2035. We're looking at $140 million per year in infrastructure improvements. After we make some of these significant investments, that number would drop down to about $45 million per year, and that goes out through 2050.
That's also why the legislators are pitching the idea of an Oregon Rail Department. The theory is that it would be easier to pursue funding for rail if there's a state agency whose only job is rail.
I think ODOT is doing well enough, but I think the point is that we ought to be challenging ourselves to be visionary and to do more, to do better things. And to do that, I think it's helpful to have a focused agency dealing with railroads as a specific category.
Now, a dedicated rail agency would be somewhat unusual, but it would not be the first time we've set up a separate agency for one mode of transportation. There's already an Oregon Aviation Department, for example. And it's not just about the Amtrak Cascades route. Amtrak has 2 other routes that stop in Portland, Coast Starlight to Los Angeles and Empire Builder to Chicago. But that still leaves many Oregon cities with no passenger rail at all. Some of those cities used to be covered by a 4th route called Amtrak Pioneer, which followed I-84 through the Gorge and then down the east side of the state. The line was discontinued in 1997, but last year, Amtrak published a conceptual expansion plan that included reviving the route. All legislators we spoke to said they wanted to see the Pioneer return, and they heard similar comments from Eastern Oregon residents when they held a public hearing in Ontario last summer.
I have been advocating for the reinstatement of the Pioneer passenger rail service since 2019. I-84 is closing more frequently with severe winter storms due to climate change.
In addition to family visits and stuff like that, having the Amtrak stop in Baker City was really helpful. And it's been, would be useful in the current era because transportation options we have as we get older are needed.
I too am going to talk about the train. I know that you're here to address some critical funding issues for ODOT, but there are many of us who are advocating for the return of rail service.
So we'll see if that Pioneer line makes a comeback nearly 3 decades after being discontinued. Now let's briefly talk about high rail speed. The bill in the legislature focused on that is more of a long-term thing, spurred by the Metro government wanting to begin studying where a Portland high-speed rail station could go. But the focus during this session is improving the current system while keeping future options in mind to potentially pursue down the line.
High-speed rail, which is also great, but we know will take decades and a lot of financial investments. And so I would say that I think the rail department and what I'm hoping in the next few years is that we can really also explore some of the immediate investments in rail that we can make that can improve our rail system in the short term.
Well, we will keep you posted on those bills in Salem as the session moves forward. But now it is your turn. What are your thoughts on passenger rail in Oregon and the Northwest? Do you use it? Would you use it if there were more trains? Let us know. Email the story at kgw.com or call and leave us a voicemail, 503-226-5090.